Hi there, it's Marla with the Narrate team. This week's message continues the conversation in the Art of Emotion series. What if our emotions tell us what our hearts are doing with God and people? What happens when our first impulse is to judge or change our emotions? Enjoy the message as we continue looking at how our emotions affect our lives and relationships.
So, it's great to be with you. We're in this series called, what is it called? The Art of Emotion. And I like it when things stay superficial more than real, but for many of us, it's not superficial right now. So we're going to do something this morning that is befitting, I think, of our culture and what it means to be family together. So yesterday, we had the unfortunate experience of memorializing a woman named Lisa Huff. She was 40 and lost a prolonged battle with aggressive cancer. And she used to always sit back there and run slides. And in fact, I think poor Lisa, we often say that when we get to the other side of the veil that we'll learn that we had more wrong about God than right. And to whatever degree that's true for Lisa, I think I have a lot to do with it because probably nobody other than Kate and some of the staff have listened to me communicate more messages than Lisa because she had the unfortunate privilege of sitting there 3 times every time she was there. So it felt appropriate to me that we just not do slides this week and kind of step into that in solidarity with those of you still grieving that and just, part of, I think, what we have to do with death is get upfront and personal with it and not run from it. So I'd like to pray, and then we're going to jump in. Lord, thanks for the reality that you made us human and made us emotional, and though we often don't like it that way, especially when it's not the fun stuff, we trust you. And really we're here because it's our desire to serve people more effectively, to love people more effectively, to be better forms of what you had in mind for humanity, to know and follow you, Jesus, but to do so in ways that are a blessing to our community. We love you. Amen. So last week we did this thing where we talked about our experience of emotion over time, and we wondered if maybe the common expectation we have of our experience of emotion over time might look like this. If this was time, and how's that? And this was our experience of emotion. I wonder how much our vocabulary, the way we speak, we even say things to our kids like, stop being emotional. I wonder for how much of us the expectation is that with health, with time, with maturity, with growth, that our emotions will go down. And it sure seems to me, the more I'm learning and getting old, that if anything, the reverse might be true. The degree to which you do life correctly, the more difficult it gets. Whether that's because of suffering in your job or the loss of friends and family or just the reality of what it means to be a human on a broken planet trying to love God. I wonder, and this is what we said last week, if in fact our experience of emotion ought to look more like that. That God's not calling us away from emotion, but deeper into emotion. And in fact, that the management of emotion and this thing that we have historically called discipleship are actually far more similar than maybe we've let on. That maybe the management of emotion is every bit as important as the management of behavior. In fact, maybe it's more important. And one of the questions we asked last week was, what if God is emotional? Like, what if God experiences emotion? Well, what if when the text describes him as angry or full of joy or frustrated or not sure? Well, what if that's not some kind of trope? What if it's not some kind of trite statement? But what if God is genuinely inside time with us as well as outside of time? But nonetheless, what if God is relationally vulnerable and present enough with you and with me and with us that he experiences emotion the way you experience emotion inside of a marriage, inside parenting, inside of your vocation, inside of any kind of relationship? What if God suffers? What if God knows the pain of suffering? What if God's experience of even Jesus' own death on the cross didn't have the smug look that we often make it seem like it must have? In fact, one of the questions we asked last week was, did Jesus experience emotion because he was human or because he was God? And to me, that's an important question because it sure seems to me that if we're not careful, we create the assumption that the moment Jesus ceased to be human, trusting that we're recognizing that most believe or many believe that he was God and human, the moment he ceased to be human, the question could be asked, did he cease to be emotional? Well, was being emotional, is it something that we have in common with God, or is it a part of this thing called humanity, and only we experience it. So last week, really we left with this question of what if discipleship, what if following Jesus, what if learning what it means to follow God, what if living in grace has a lot to do with trusting God to teach us how to manage emotion? And what if the great thing about God is he's not like a travel agent pointing to places he's never been? He's leading us through things like death that he himself has experienced. Which leads to this question this week, because I got frustrated with myself and I went, wait a minute, but what's the value of emotion? Like, what's the point of it all? Because when you're grieving the loss of someone like Lisa, or you're dealing with some kind of brokenness in your life, the reality is it's easy to go like, I think I'd rather go for neutral. Right? And we actually, frankly, have lots of options that at least give us the perception that neutral is an option. And in many ways it is. But what if neutral's not God's option for us? In fact, here's really the question I want to ask is, what's the value of feeling? And certainly there's a scientific answer to that question that I'm not qualified to answer, nor do I have I done the research to represent their view of that. But there's also a theological answer to the question. There's an answer to the question from the text. And to be honest with you, I'm not really interested in talking about the text from some of the categories that we have for the last couple hundred years. But I am interested in looking at it from the context of this is a congruent story about people following God and God chasing after people. And somehow their story brings us in front and center with Jesus. And he seems to be the revelation of what this God has been trying to say, the epitome of what this God was trying to say. And I guess the question I want to ask is, from this thing that we call the Bible, what is God? What is the experience of people? What is the experience of God as it relates to what's the value of emotion? And here's why I think this is important, that if we don't have an answer to this question, and I don't know, maybe it's not even possible to have one until later in life. I'm not sure, or at least until you face some kind of suffering. I'm not sure. But what if we don't develop some kind of informed, passionate answer to the question, then the danger becomes that we think that bad emotion is bad, which is categorically, I would like to suggest, like even saying the phrase is probably very unfortunate, because we go good emotion, bad emotion. Like, dark emotion, light emotion, positive emotion, negative emotion. What if all those categories are dangerous? But what if the danger of not having some answer to the question is we think the goal of life is exactly what Roman culture has been telling us, and that is that to be successful is to make sure that you eliminate all the unwanted emotion and triple down on all the wanted ones. Which means that when we experience unwanted emotion, we do the things that we do. We numb. Or really, we're numbing as a symptom of we judge. There's a guy named Dan Allender. I highly recommend his work. He's written a book called The Cry of the Soul. The great thing about Dan is he has advanced degrees both in counseling psychology. He's a PhD in counseling psychology. He also has an MDiv from the theological perspective. And Dan points out that the real dangerous response to emotion is that when we first experience it, we judge it and we change it. So to judge it is to take all of our categories, many of them relative to our own background and values and morals, and we first ascertain, is this emotion I should or should not have, I want or don't want? And to change it is to go, okay, well, therefore I want to not have it. I want to get more of this one, depending on positive or negative or however we categorize them, which is where things like shopping and drinking and drugs and starting something new and all kinds of covers come in, because it's an attempt, after shaming ourselves for having the wrong emotions, to create more of the ones that we think we're supposed to have. I think we could think of it this way. How many of you love Ross? Just raise your hand if you love to go to Ross. Come on. This is full participation this morning, because I'm about to be very judgmental. And how many of you loathe Ross? Like, it's the last place on the planet you ever want to go. Okay, back up. How many of you on the continuum of hoarder versus minimalist, like how many of you are over here on the hoarder side? Maybe you need to represent your spouse. and how many of you are on the minimalist side? Like I got here this morning, I was like, that's my favorite set that the Grand Street has ever done. If this is hoarder and this is minimalist, I'm like over here. I love to throw stuff away. In fact, a couple years ago, my wife got me one of those safety razors for Christmas, like the hipster thing, and then after bleeding through my face for a couple years, I decided I was done using it, and so this week I was in the medicine cabinet doing what you do, and I looked up and there was like 20 of these safety razors still left in the medicine cabinet, and I was like, I haven't thrown those away yet. And it was one of the highlights of my day to grab that package of razors and throw it in the garbage. Household waste, whatever, that doesn't do much for me. But when I can take one of those Costco fruit boxes, that you come home with and fill it full of stuff and take it to the dumpster, and I love that feeling. So all that should be kept into view as I process this. But for those of you who love Ross, those of you who hate Ross, no offense if you work there, own it, manage it, whatever. I can't stand Ross, and I've never been able to figure out why, but I think I figured it out this week. And it's pretty simple. It's because it's full of crap that you don't need. I mean, sorry to be so blunt, but right? By definition, it didn't sell at the last place, so they brought it to this place. So you would buy. Now, I know that sounds kind of, some of you, your budget's required that you got to find good deals and all those different things. I get all that categorically, but seriously, like it's just clutter. And you go like, well, yeah, but every once in a while you find a good deal. Yeah, and every once in a while you find a quarter with one of those little machines you walk through the park with too, but I don't see you walking through the park with one of those little machines. Or how about garage sales? Any of you, how many of you love garage sales? All the hoarders raise their hand, right? And how many of you are like, I hate them, I hate them, I hate them? Like, when I drive by a garage sale, it takes a lot of emotional self-control not to stick my head out the window and just scream like, throw it away! Just throw it all away! I could go on, but I know that there's people here that work at TJ Maxx and that the thrift stores raise money for good causes and all those different things. But here's my point. I think the danger here is if we don't think about emotion and the value of it, especially things like suffering and sadness and pain, I wonder if we get caught in this hedonistic Western Greek Roman trap of telling ourselves that the only point of life is to experience the positive emotions and that the negative have absolutely no value whatsoever. What's the value of feeling? Well, what Dr. Allender says, and this has been something I've been ruminating on for some time, what Dr. Allender suggests is the first value of feeling is it begs you to stop and to listen. Now, I know that's why I showed that Everyone Loves Raymond clip, because it kind of speaks to some of the cliches and the discomfort we have with that, but nonetheless, what if emotion is designed to cause you not to judge and not to change, not initially, but emotion is a light on the dashboard that tells you to listen and go, what's going on here? And why am I feeling this? And what if what we see in the text, though we wouldn't call it advanced scientific culture, what if we see is advanced therapeutic, psychological, spiritual culture of a people who seem to have understood this? In Psalm 42, and again, we don't have slides, but why, my soul, are you so downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Later in the same psalm, why, my soul, are you downcast? Why so disturbed within me? Next psalm, why, my soul, are you so downcast? Why so disturbed within me? It's like the psalmist is, and again, these are community experiences. They're not the individualistic ones that we have come to know and cherish. It's like there's this value on looking deeply inside and going, I'm sad, I'm messed up, I'm reaching for some kind of substance. What's going on in me that I'm wanting and needing to do this? In fact, I think, and the danger is that it's just I that think this because I've not found research that backs it, but I actually think that you can point to the Gospels and see that Jesus was the master of this. That this is one of the areas where he wore the double black belt. That he wasn't just deeply profound spiritually and could think esoteric thoughts, but that he was deeply connected emotionally. I think one of the greatest pieces of evidence for that is the day that he showed up at the temple and started acting like a junior hire and flipping tables on their side and then grabbing a wet towel and snapping people with it. Though it wasn't a wet towel, it was some kind of leather thing, a whip. But you may know the story. John tells it, as well as some of the other gospel writers, where he showed up at the temple one day in his 30s, and he got so frustrated because what he could see were people were selling animals, and they were exchanging money, and he started throwing stuff around, making declarations like, this is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations, and zeal for your house will consume me. And when we first read that, we often use it as evidence to go like, see, Anger's not necessarily a bad thing, which I'm going to agree there. But I wonder if it's more than a tantrum going on. I actually wonder if what Jesus was doing there is more similar to, say, the Major League Baseball manager that gets ejected from a game, not because he lost his cool, but because he could see a team that's flat, and he's strategically going to do something to get them engaged. Like an expert principal or parent who understands that you can't always make the same disciplinary decision. I've got to get involved here. See, I think there's evidence for that because, well, let's just think about this. The temple, many of you may know, had several boundaries in it, each of which limited who could go past it. I mean, the deepest boundary was the holiest of holies. It was a place that only one person once a year could go. Beyond that, there was places that only the priests and the Levites could go. Beyond that, there were places, just working outside in, or inside out, there were places where only Jewish men could go. After that, there was places where only Jewish women could go. After that, there were places, and this is a big deal, where anybody could go, Jewish or not, Gentile or not, Yahweh follower or not. It's called the court of the Gentiles, which says something about the bias of this God, that he set aside place in his house for people who didn't understand him, maybe didn't like him, and probably didn't even believe in him yet. Jesus' frustration was the marketplace that had been set up was set up in that court. So a place that was designed for reverence, for questions, for some kind of awe toward God, had been turned into Walmart. If you've ever been to a marketplace, say in Latin America somewhere, or especially in the Middle East, you can begin to picture what that would have been like. It'd be a little tricky to pray there. We're also told that there was an exchange of money that was happening. The context there is that the temple, by Jesus' day, the temple authorities had made the decision that there was a certain currency that would be allowed to be used in the temple for offerings and purchases, and conveniently enough, it was a currency that was largely unused outside of the temple. Which meant that when you showed up from 300 miles away and you brought with you your currency, which wasn't all that common, but if you brought some kind of coinage with you and you wanted to use that to buy something or to make an offering just from it, you first had to exchange it with their currency, which of course involved some extortion. Some of you remember what it was like to go to Europe, say 20 years ago, and how you always had to exchange your money, and you might show up with $100, but your $100 very quickly turned into $75 because they were going to charge you a rate just for exchanging your money. That's what was going on. Further, there were animals that were being sold, doves, sheep, and cattle. Now, obviously, part of the worship experience that I actually think has more mystery to it than we often realize involved the giving of animals. And the original intention of God, it seems, from the Torah and the older Jewish scriptures, is that you would bring your own animal from your own farm. You bring your best. But what had happened was the temple establishment figured out that when you bring a sheep from Nazareth, they don't make any money on that. And so they figured out that they would expand upon their opportunities to disqualify your offering for not being good enough, which by Jesus' day generally discouraged people from bringing an animal from their own farm, their own house, and they just showed up planning to buy one of theirs, which is something like buying a Coke in an airport. It's like the Seinfeld, right? Like, do you know what the outside world charges for a hamburger? Yes, we do, and it doesn't matter. Suddenly, you're buying a sheep that was at a way inflated price. And so what you have here is classic religiosity, not serving people, but serving itself. Now, my question is this: for how long had Jesus observed that culture? How many times had he been to temple and saw that turn of events? 30? I mean, we know he's in his 30s, which seemed like he came from a family that went regularly. Maybe several times a year. I don't know, somewhere 30, 60, 100 times. How many times had he gone to the temple and experienced the anger, the frustration, the wrath, the sense of like, this isn't just? How many times? So my question is, what if Jesus' response in his 30s was calculated? What if when Luke tells us that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places to pray, what if it wasn't like a good Protestant with his Starbucks coffee and his study Bible and his moleskin journal where he was going to go learn something titillating about God that he could meditate on the rest of the day? What if Jesus' habit of getting alone with God had a lot to do with listening, being attentive to? That's not to say that the scriptures didn't have a place in his life at all. It is to say that they didn't have Bibles. And And Torah scrolls were expensive. He didn't have quiet times with written scripture, maybe with memorized scripture, but what if Jesus' experience in the temple, and all I can do is speculate, is actually born of this practice we see elsewhere in the Gospels where Jesus was very attentive, perhaps emotionally. And he'd spent a lifetime going, you know what? That system does not represent me or my Father. That system is taking advantage of people. That system isn't serving people, it's serving itself. What if Jesus had spent a lifetime listening to that emotion, and like many a good revolutionary, had a calculated moment where he went, enough, I'm done. You know, in Matthew 26, I'm going to argue that we see more evidence that Jesus was attentive to what he was feeling and what value it brought. Jesus was in a place called Gethsemane, which you may or may not know is actually, it's an olive press. And cultural scholars will tell you there's a word picture happening here because you might have noticed that oil doesn't come easily from the olive. And so an olive press and an olive grove, the press would involve a several 1,000-pound stone that you would roll over top of the olives where you would press out the oil. Watch for the experience that Jesus has, because you go like, why did he do this at Gethsemane? Here's the picture. And Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane and said to them, sit here while I go over there and pray. He took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Notice the language that he could give to what he was feeling, or at least somebody could give to what he was feeling. Then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Wait a minute. I thought God's not supposed to feel that. I thought if you believe right, you don't have those feelings. I thought if you're the Son of God, you don't get discouraged. Stay here and keep watch with me. Going a little further, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed. My Father, if it's possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Wait a minute, I thought if you're doing faith right, then at the moment where it's clear that you're going to die, you just welcome it with open arms. Doesn't seem like Jesus did. I mean, ultimately he did, but there were moments where he's like, if there's a detour, sign me up. He was feeling things, and he seems to have known it. My point is simply this. What if Jesus knew better than most that feeling an emotion, it kind of brings to the surface the cry of our soul, the sense that life isn't perfect, and it's broken, and there's injustices, and we go to a place like a temple, which is supposed to be designed for people, and it's not designed for the right people. You know, listen to the way Paul says it. It seems to me that Paul was just as attentive to what was going on and the intersection of his emotion and theology. He says this, we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. Not only so, but we ourselves who have the first fruit of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. Paul seems to be saying that life doesn't always work out, that the experience of life is one that's going to remind us that we are profoundly broken, that the world is profoundly broken. Listen, what if one of the uncomfortable things emotion does is it exposes the illusion that life is safe, that it's controllable, that it's predictable? What if emotion exposes the reality that to follow Jesus isn't to avoid suffering? Listen, what if emotion begs us to listen? And here's the question that, for me, makes Dan Allender's work absolutely profound. He asked the question, what if emotion, what if it tells us where our hearts are at with God and where they're at with people? Like, if it's true that the highest value of God that he has for us is relationship, what if emotion, all of them, what if the first thing we're filtering for and looking for is what is my emotion telling me about my relationships with God and with others? You know, a guy named Andy Crouch, who's this great thinker, one of my all-time favorite, I'm doing some research for a parenting series that we'll do in the fall, and he's written a book called The Tech-Wise Family. And since we've all got that mastered, I thought, well, why would we research that? And the premise of his book is really that if we're not careful, we prioritize screens over relationships. And it's in that section where he makes a statement that to me is one of the most, I'll let you judge it. He says, life is difficult, and if you do it well, it gets more difficult. His point is relationship. His point is to expose the irony that if you make relationship your priority with God and with others, then you are by definition setting yourself up for greater and greater levels of suffering and sorrow and grief. Joy, sure, hopefully, but also sorrow and grief. There's a man, Ronald Rolheiser, who's written a book called Sacred Fire, and in there he suggests that there's 3 phases of life, 3 phases of discipleship. And in the first one, he says, is learning to get a life. It's this idea of, in our first phase of life, you're looking for your purpose. He says the second phase of life is learning to give away your life. He says the third phase of life, which is largely underutilized and misunderstood today, is giving away your death. It's the assumption that if you do life well, there will be a season of intense suffering. My question is this: what if emotion gives us the opportunity to evaluate relationship? Which would mean that in many contexts, say a place like yesterday, where the grief over the loss of Lisa was profound, that the emotion's actually like a blue ribbon. It's actually saying your pain is indicative of the fact that you did life well, or at least she did. What if anger towards someone, bitterness towards someone is actually an emotional response telling you something about relationship? And what if our anger or emotion towards God is telling us something about where our heart is with God? The great news is the Bible doesn't ask us to sanitize our emotion towards God. That's why there's these psalms called the Psalms of Lament, where essentially, we're going to talk about this next winter sometime in a very heartwarming series called Preparing to Suffer. But in the Psalms of Lament, what you see is people declaring to God that they are victims of injustice that God could have controlled had he chose to, and they didn't. And it's step one of their walking through this process of making sure their emotional relationship with God is a 360 relationship, not just a pie in the sky, happy, happy, happy kind of thing. Listen, I guess my question this morning, and I'm sorry if I'm being a little too preachy and not asking enough questions, but what if Jesus led the way in going, no, be emotionally aware and watch out for those tendencies to numb and avoid and shame and correct. And start the experience by asking, what is this emotion telling me about what my heart is doing towards this person and in this relationship? And what is my emotion telling me about what my heart is doing with God? And what if God doesn't need you to sanitize it and hold off conversation until you can sound a lot like most songs? What if God wants the whole, the real, the honest you? And listen, what if the religiosity that so many of you have come to loathe looks nothing like the heart of God? But instead, this God's priority for you and for us is relationship. And the culmination of who he is and what he looks like is found in his son, Jesus. I'd like to pray, God. Thanks, Lord, that you had a design for this thing called creation and humanity, and yet you know the grief of things not going according to plan. Thanks, God, that you more than anybody understand that brokenness and sorrow doesn't mean end of relationship. It just means a new way of loving through self-giving. God, it seems obvious that so many of the ills that plague our marriages and our relationships and our friendships and especially our spirituality are born of this practice of shaming our emotional experience rather than listening to it. And so we would love it if you made us more courageous in our willingness to listen. Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.